Our first presentation today is by Kate Dietrick, Archivist of the Nathan and Teresa Berman Upper Midwest Jewish Archives. Her title is Whiskey and Vice, Uncovering Jewish Criminals. Like any group during Prohibition, the Jewish community had a few criminals. Interest in this societal underbelly has surged in the past few years with little documentation to be found. But what happens when you uncover a collection on criminals you've never heard of before? How do you research criminal activity in the archives when those criminals never wanted to be found?
Okay. Hi. All right. So, I have a confession to make. When I first pitched the idea of this theme of Down the Rabbit Hole to my fellow colleagues, it was born entirely out of selfishness. Sure, I had an inkling that proved true. I was not alone in my spiraling down a rabbit hole of research. But mostly, I wanted to come to terms, shed some light, admit to myself that I have a problem. I become obsessed with materials in our collection. Whether it's pulling old street maps to see where a building was located because that cross street no longer exists, or reading old correspondence and falling in love with an adorable man that, let's face it, Kate, has been dead for 50 years. Anyone who has done research can attest to this. You find one thing that charms you, that changes the way you look at something, or leads you down a different direction, and before you know it, here you are again, elbow deep in another box filled with musty papers, miles from where you started. It often happens at some point in any given month that someone will email me, or in conversation when hearing that I'm the archivist for the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives, they will ask, do you have any information on Kid Can? Kid Can, of course, being Isidor Blumenfeld, notorious local Jewish mobster who was active from the 1920s to 1950s. Depending on who is asking, I'll either politely say, alas, no, we don't, or I'll make a joke. I'll say, why, yes, Kid Can kept meticulous diaries of all his comings and goings. Dear diary, today I bribed some cops before shooting up my enemies. But of course that's not true, because we don't have that kind of information here in the archives. We simply don't have primary sources of Jewish participation in organized crime locally. That's not to say it didn't happen or that information isn't out there. A lot of stories haven't been shared or even spoken in the past because of the concept that what is bad for one Jew is bad for the entire community. Don't draw attention to Jewish criminals for fear of making the entire Jewish community look bad. Which, when you're already a persecuted minority, this makes sense. But the interest remains. And this interest in Jewish criminal activity most often isn't suspect. The goal in pursuing this topic isn't to revere criminals and killers, nor is it to make the Jewish community look bad or make it out as though many Jews are criminals. Criminality existed in every pocket of society. The interest in this topic lies in the in-between, in finding the truth of the past, however murky. When, back in the spring of 2015, a journalist was researching for a piece on Kid Can, he insisted on coming to the archives to speak to me. He came, but I told him, like I tell everyone, that I didn't have one shred of information on any Jewish criminals in our collection, which I thought was true. And it was an answer I hated giving. All of us archivists and curators love to help researchers. It is our driving motivation each day. So when I have to turn people away saying we have nothing to help them in their research, it is really, really frustrating. In situations like this, I detest saying, alas, no, and leaving it at that. I want to send people away with, alas, no, but. And that but would be information on where to go next, what other steps they could take, where else they could look. Send them away not defeated, but with agency on where to go next. Yet when it came to research on criminal activity, I didn't have anything, and I didn't know where to point people towards next. And that was the way it was until I fell down this rabbit hole. It all began last year when I got a new student worker, Erin. Here in Archives and Special Collections, we spend a lot of time training our student workers. Archives are frankly kind of weird. They take a lot of attention to detail. The way in which we do things are usually foreign to many incoming students, and so we tend to ease them into this work slowly. As I was teaching Erin to process collections, I pulled one that I thought would be easy for her, a newsletter collection. The Jewish Historical Society kept newsletters from different organizations in the area, and so this was pretty straightforward. Organize the newsletters by organization and then by year. Easy peasy. Any of my fellow archivists are probably laughing at me right now because we all know just when you think a collection will be easy, it never is. So at some point, Erin came up to me with a small folder and said, Kate, what do I do with this? What this was this. A pile of crumbling old newspaper articles. My immediate reaction was, oh no. Because why? Why were these in the newsletter collection? What did these have to do with anything? Upon investigation, these clippings from unidentified newspapers dating between 1919 and 1945 all dealt with two men, Mike Weissman and Dave Weissman, and their run-ins with bootlegging and houses of prostitution. It was Mike, the older of the two, who caught my eye initially. There were over 140 articles from 1919 to 1923 that made Mike Weissman seem to be the worst local criminal around. And yet I had never heard of him. Here I'd been saying for years that we had absolutely nothing related to Jewish criminals. Was I now a liar? How many more of these hidden collections were floating around unnoticed? And who were these guys? Were they brothers? Were they even Jewish? And who donated this collection in the first place? Before I take you down the rabbit hole further, let's set the scene in Minneapolis, and let's begin with Vice. When we first encounter Mike Weissman, it is 1919. At this point, it's the end of a long era of what was ostensibly legalized prostitution in Minneapolis. From the 1860s until the 19-teens, quote, houses of ill fame, also called resorts, bordellos, and disorderly houses, were seen as a necessary evil. Many people were against prostitution, but people just couldn't seem to figure out ways to get rid of it. Lawmakers wavered between tolerating and suppressing prostitution, depending on the political winds of the time. This, quote, social evil was condemned time and again in the papers, but of course no one wanted to admit the truth. Saloons and brothels existed because there was a demand for them. Beginning in 1868, city leaders reluctantly devised a sort of partnership that both politicians and prostitutes knew to be merely an elaborate show against vice. Madams and prostitutes would trot down to court on specific days of the month, plead guilty to prostitution, and pay a small fine for breaking the law. They were then released, told not to do this again, but of course everyone knew they returned to their line of business. The fines provided revenue for the city, and it made it appear as though police were doing something about this scourge on society. The way in which these houses ran was more or less the same. One person, man or woman, sometimes a madam, sometimes not, owned the building itself. The madam would live in the resort and conduct the day-to-day business, and a typical resort housed 5 to 8 inmates, as they were called. A large part of their profits would often stem from selling liquor to customers as well. When the police would go after disorderly homes, they usually left the inmates alone and legally went after the owners and madams instead. The areas that were the established red light districts of the time were along the Mississippi River. The First Street District, along First Street just south of Hennepin Avenue but north of the Stone Arch Bridge, and the Main Street District, along what is now known as St. Anthony, Maine, were thriving from the 1870s to 1910. And a third district, the 11th Avenue District, popped up later, along 11th Avenue South and Washington Avenue, which at the present is just on the other side of 35W from where we are right now. It was understood that these red light districts were favorable. They corralled the vice into certain areas of the city where upstanding and orderly citizens wouldn't have to encounter or even see prostitutes, drunkards, or licentiousness. This riverfront area catered to mill and migrant workers and remained steady business for decades. But due to a number of factors, anti-vice and temperance movements gained momentum around the turn of the century, along with the oft-quoted and rarely true outcry against what was termed white slavery. After years of pushback, the red light districts were mostly closed in 1910. Prostitution remained, of course, scattered throughout the city, but was now dealt with legally and more severely. By the time we meet Mike Weissman, prostitutes are regularly taken off the streets and sent to the workhouse, and bordello owners are punished in court. Next, let's talk whiskey, or rather alcohol as a whole. After a long battle, October 28, 1919, saw the passage of the Volstead Act, which set down methods for enforcing the 18th Amendment, which prohibited intoxicating liquors. This went into effect in January of 1920, and the country was to remain dry until 1933. Leading up to and throughout Prohibition, there remained two sides, wets and dries. The division between these two sides was not only determined by drinking habits, but also determined by race, class, and geography. Dries tended to be rural, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. The temperance movement gains momentum, the most momentum, between 1880 and 1920, which not coincidentally coincides with mass immigration in the United States. As writer Daniel Okrent argues in his publication Last Call, The Rise of Prohibition, one of the Dries' primary motivations for temperance was fear of losing the country to immigrants. During this period, about 2 million Eastern European Jews make their way to America. Jews were on the wet side, and pre-Prohibition had seen them largely engaged legally in distilleries and the alcohol trade. And in this temperance movement, Jews attempted to negotiate their previously very positive and active relationship to alcohol, while also figuring out their American identity in a country that was now against legal alcohol. Jewish saloon keepers, liquor dealers, brewers, distillers, and others were now suspect. Some American Jews like to present themselves as the best sorts of Americans, as the ones who consume alcohol regularly but are not drunkards. And the Volstead Act did indeed allow Jewish families 10 gallons of kosher wine a year for religious use. Okrent in Last Call estimates that half of bootleggers around the country were Eastern European Jews. For many reasons, the lure of bootlegging was strong across many communities and became a thriving business, reaching $3.6 billion nationally by 1926, which is around $43.4 billion in today's time. So, we've set the scene, now back on the trail, back to the pile of deteriorating newspaper clippings that were folded and folded into tiny rectangles that would tear and crumble upon touching, that were in no discernible order, and all had to do with the Weissmans. After I painstakingly unfolded each article, placed them in plastic sheets, and put them in chronological order, I pored over this newfound collection to uncover the story. And I'm going to try to go through this quickly, and alas, I have to leave parts out because remember, there's 140 articles about this one guy. And I'm not even going to dive into David Weissman, just Mike. So here we go. It all begins with our first clipping, June 7th, 1919. Here we discover that Mike Weissman is being charged with running a resort at 120 South 2nd Street. This area is near the old, formerly somewhat legal red light 1st Street district downtown. He has been indicted by the Committee of 13, an outgrowth of the American Patriotic League, an organization developed during the war for the purpose of guarding the morals of American soldiers and sailors. The madam found running the House of Vice, Dorothy, has at this point already been convicted and sent to the workhouse. The Committee of 13, however, was mainly after Mike Weissman as the man in charge. He owned a soft drink joint on the lower floor and allegedly would direct certain men up to the 2nd floor to meet women. Back in 1917, he pled guilty in municipal court to the same charge, different location, and paid a $5 fine. This time, for whatever reason, the Committee of 13 wants Weissman to serve jail time. During his trial, various character witnesses are called to testify, including Sheriff Oscar Martinson, who, quote, admitted that he had heard some remarks concerning Weissman that were not complimentary, but he had heard other things that were. During the war, he said he visited the place several times, but he'd never seen the defendant there. Okay, this is potentially questionable that the sheriff gives this quite positive testimony, but this seems like a relatively cut and dry case of vice. But by March 5th, 1920, the jury fails to reach a verdict. By May 5th, 1920, things get stickier. Mike Weissman, along with 12 other men, are charged with receiving, concealing, and aiding in the concealment and transportation of considerable quantities of whiskey imported from Winnipeg to Minneapolis in cars containing scrap iron on the Sioux line. The men plead guilty, and quickly corruption comes to light. Weissman allegedly paid off officials Harry Leslie and Hugh Leonard, two deputy sheriffs, to provide Weissman and his men protection in unloading the whiskey brought into Minneapolis from Winnipeg. This federal case now turns into an effort to indict corrupt police. While on the stand, Weissman testifies that he could make $5 a case for liquor, with the money divided among the men. Weissman also brags of fixing the sheriff, the county attorney, and two customs officers, and that he had made $100,000 out of the liquor business since July 1st, 1919. While this federal whiskey trial is underway, on June 15th, 1920, the Minneapolis vice trial for Weissman begins anew, since the first trial ended in a hung jury. On June 16th, the jurors are chosen. And this I find so interesting. By this point, there's clearly enough interest in this case for it to be widely covered in the newspapers. And here we have the newspapers printing the names, occupations, and addresses of all of the jurors. Which, you've got a criminal who's been known to bribe people on the stands, and you print the names and addresses of the jurors. Does this not seem like a terrible idea? One ripe for more bribery. By June 25th, the jury returns. 7 hours of deliberation, no verdict. October 27th, 1920, third trial, re-indictment, new evidence. He pleads not guilty, and the papers note that he's currently under stay of sentence for 1 year and 6 months in the federal penitentiary for that whiskey smuggling conspiracy, which landed the bribed, now former Sheriff Oscar Martinson. Remember him? The one who testified for Weissman? He's now in federal jail. Weissman will soon follow. The trial for the vice charge drags on. By March 7th, then county attorney, later to become governor, Floyd B. Anderson, lays out his case. Quote, "We will show how, while Weissman was owner of the place, women worked in shifts like men work in the mills. We will show how Weissman, to cover his connection with the place, operated the resort by proxy, leaving direction to a woman of the underworld. We will show how this woman collected half the earnings of the women in the place and how, for years, she acted as Weissman's agent and representative. Olson means business this time." March 9th, Hugh Leonard, former deputy sheriff under Oscar Martinson, is called to witness. He says he was given a warrant sometime in January 1919 for service upon May Young, one of the inmates at Weissman's resort. Leonard claims that Weissman came in and asked Leonard if he had a warrant for Young, and Leonard said yes. Weissman told him, "Bury it." Leonard said he couldn't, he wasn't the sheriff, so Weissman went into the sheriff and then left. Leonard said that then Sheriff Martinson came out of his office and told Leonard, "Bury it." March 17th, remember this is the third trial. Jury still cannot come to a conclusion. Final vote listed as 9-3 for conviction. At this point, facing a fourth trial, Weissman asked for the trial to be held in St. Paul, claiming, quote, "It would be impossible to get a fair trial in Minneapolis," and claims agencies here were, quote, "out to get him." Says that the newspapers are unfair in reporting the trial and that jurors are afraid to vote to acquit because people might believe that they'd accepted a bribe. I wonder why. March 28th, 1921, the trial's moved to Hastings in Dakota County. By June 7th, in this, his fourth trial for running a house of vice, Weissman is convicted with a sentence of 1 to 7 years confinement in the state penitentiary in Stillwater. Granted a stay of execution, he appeals many, many times. Finally, after all of his appeals are up, on October 30th, 1922, after years of legal battle, Mike Weissman leaves Minneapolis in custody of a deputy United States Marshal for Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas, with his sentence of 18 months for the Minneapolis-Winnipeg whiskey smuggling conspiracy. While in federal prison, he still attempts to fight the vice charge and attempts to avoid going to Stillwater prison, but he can't get out of it. On August 16th, 1923, he is released from Leavenworth and returns to Minneapolis via train. He's supposed to make his way to Stillwater prison to serve his second sentence. Not trusting him to flee, in Inver Grove, the sheriff of Dakota County apparently flags down the train and takes Weissman off the train. Then Sheriff Earl Brown and County Attorney Floyd B. Olson personally drive Mike Weissman to Stillwater Prison, where his name is recorded in the state prison book little more than an hour later. I hope by now your faces look exactly like mine, which was, what? Who is this guy? At this point, I'm fully down the rabbit hole and I become obsessed. And so late nights and weekends, I began reading secondary sources to try to gain more information. Augie's Secrets by Neil Carlin, John Dillinger Slept Here by Paul Maccabee, Last Call by Daniel Okrent, Jews and Booze by Marnie Davis, Twin Cities Prohibition by Elizabeth Johannick, and Minneapolis Madam by Penny Peterson. All great background reads for the time. None of them mention Weissman. And I have so many questions, namely, what happened to Mike in the end? How long was he in Stillwater? Why had I never heard of him? And I was also worried that after all of this, what if he wasn't Jewish? What if he crept into our collection and had absolutely nothing to do with the Jewish community? And if he was Jewish, were there a lot of Jewish bootleggers or other brothel owners? So what to do next? I had now myself reached the moment that all the researchers had when they needed my guidance. Where else do we go? So I figured, I'm going to find out. I had to branch beyond these walls. First stop, a trek down the light rail to the Minneapolis City Hall to see the Minneapolis City Archives. Here, with the help of the city clerk, I pored over two things. One was the workhouse registry, and two, the Minneapolis prison log. After combing the pages, much to my dismay, neither had mention of Mike Weissman. But here's what I learned about the workhouse registry. Tons of people during this time were spending time in the workhouse for prostitution, frequenting disorderly houses, and keeping disorderly houses. Their punishment was the workhouse. Why was Mike Weissman's jail time? Why was he different? And in the prison log I looked at, dating from 1918 to 1921, Weissman is not listed as being charged in Minneapolis. He was never booked despite being charged multiple times. Was this because, as we saw, he was in cahoots with the sheriff? So with many, many questions unanswered, one blustery Saturday, I trekked over to the Minnesota Historical Society. Over 75 years have passed since Weissman was a prisoner in Stillwater Penitentiary, which meant that his inmate records are now public. I spent nearly 3 hours poring through his records. First off, Mike had a long-suffering wife, Marion, who visited him in prison many times. He was received in prison in August 1923 and was paroled September 1926, serving 3 years total. Also, I was finally able to determine that he was in fact Jewish. In his statement to the jury, the judge asks, "You belong to any church, Mr. Weissman?" "Yes, sir." "The Jewish church?" "Jewish church." "Belong to any lodge or social organization?" "Talmud Torah," which they spelled wrong, but whatever. Furthermore, 2 of the letters that were written to appeal for his parole come from rabbis, one from Temple Israel and the other from Knesset Israel. In 1926, when he was paroled, 7 years after all of this began, there was clearly still interest in his case. Opposition letters were received and were in his file arguing against releasing him, one from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and another from the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church. After Weissman got out of prison, he worked in real estate. Later, searching Ancestry.com, I believe I found a record of his death. Although the birth date was listed incorrectly, switching the month of his birth, his mother's information, including maiden name, was correct, leaving me to believe that this record was indeed his, and he passed away January 29th, 1949, the day after his 67th birthday in California. There is so much more research that I conducted as I fell down this rabbit hole. I could honestly go on for at least an hour more. I haven't even touched upon what made me raise my hands triumphantly in the reading room at the Minnesota Historical Society, which was a love letter in his file from who I believe to be his Madam Dorothy, proving he was having some sort of affair with her. Questions still remain, least of which is, how do we get this clippings collection in the first place? Why did the donor many years ago, before my time, collect them at all and donate them to the archives? I also have yet to see a photograph of Mike. At one point, I reached out to the National Archives at Kansas City, where the Leavenworth inmate records reside, to find out that they have nearly 100 pages of Weissman, along with a photo. And after considering spending $80 of my own money to obtain copies, I finally had to draw the line. Because there comes a time after you've fallen down the rabbit hole that you look back up from when you came and go, wait, how did I get here? How did I start with this tiny, tiny collection that led me so far down the research trail? What I loved about this experience was that, first of all, it reminded me that there are so many uncovered hidden collections within collections. I had no idea we even had these materials. Finding them was a joy. How many more of these hidden gems we have in our collection, I hope to someday know. Secondly, it reminded me that big stories can come in small packages. Sometimes when we talk about our best collections here in the archives, we equate best with large. We have the Jewish Community Relations Council records that fill 117 boxes. Wow! And yet here's this amazing tale pouring forth, contained literally in only 3 folders. There are so many hidden, untold stories throughout history. Remember, this guy was seen as such a threat that the sheriff and county attorney pulled him off the train before it arrived in Minneapolis and personally drove him to prison. And yet nary a word has been written about him in local history. And finally, in all of this research, it told me that after all of my joking, there is indeed information out there to be found regarding criminal activity. Sure, it's not in the criminal's own voice, but it is there. It can be found in city records, prison records, newspaper articles, oral histories, business records, FBI files. The research is hard. Records are scattered across different archives around the state and the country. Paul Maccabee, in his research for John Dillinger Slept Here, pored over FBI files after requesting them through the Freedom of Information Act. Local records, he noted in his emails with me, are harder to find. The St. Paul police destroyed tens of thousands of police files, vice records, prohibition documents, and more in the 1970s as they computerized their files. The criminal records specifically pertaining to Isidore Blumenfeld, aka Kid Can, are conspicuously missing from the Minneapolis Prison Department. Oral histories from people who may be willing to speak of that time can be spotty and unverifiable. But it's out there. Since I first started publicizing this talk, people in the community have emailed and called me with tidbits of criminal information. Their neighbors were in the bootlegging business, or their family sold fur from pelts bought off-season. Do we in the archives want to begin gathering these stories before they're lost? Enough time has passed that people seem to be willing to talk about the underbelly, if only in these slivers of knowledge. All of this reminds me just how hard doing research can be. As great as we are here at the University of Minnesota's Archives and Special Collections, we are not a one-stop shop. Information is scattered across so many different places. Sometimes it's nice as an archivist to get on the other side of the desk, so to speak, and see what a researcher has gone through or is about to go through once they pass through our doors, asking us kindly to help them with a piece of the puzzle. Now I know more. I don't have to say, alas, no. I can say yes and no, and point them down the many different paths that I had fun exploring. However, as I discovered, the puzzle seems to never end. The pieces never fit quite together perfectly, and you can never quite find the one missing edge piece. Thank you.